All right, this is my third video essay for Unit 1, Principles of Physiology, going over the ANS. So we got the nervous system here. The nervous system can be split into a couple of segments. We got the CNS, central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then there's the PNS, peripheral nervous system, which is comprised of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, and the somatic nervous system there. So then the ANS can be broken down into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The CNS can be broken down into the brain and the spinal cord there. So the CNS is where the cell body, nerve cell bodies lie inside the brain and spinal cord, and those are called the CNS. And then any nerve cell bodies that are outside the CNS we refer to as the peripheral nervous system. So that makes up the ANS and somatic systems here. So in the sympathetic nervous system, its points of origin it is called the thoracolumbar system because it originates in T1 and goes all the way down to about L2. The sympathetic nervous system has sympathetic chain ganglia, which are nerve cell bodies that lie outside of the central nervous system. They're part of the peripheral nervous system. And these form little bundles of nerve cell bodies. They are presynaptic nerve cell bodies. And they're postsynaptic nerve cell bodies, because the presynaptic nerve cell bodies began in the spinal cord or the cranium. So the sympathetic chain ganglia form a chain of nerve cell bodies that go up and down the spinal cord. There are also collateral ganglia in the sympathetic nervous system and what we call splanchnic nerves. So there's a couple different pathways that the sympathetic nervous system can take. So we can leave the presynaptic cell bodies in the spinal cord and then synapse at the postsynaptic cell bodies of the sympathetic chain ganglia. And then after that, that signal can be carried to numerous different places. We can also leave the sympathetic chain ganglia. We can send out a synapse that comes from the spinal cord. It passes through the sympathetic chain ganglia without synapsing, and it can synapse at the collateral ganglia. And we call this, so a collateral ganglia might go to the heart or the lungs, and then via a splanchnic nerve is how we're going to reach our organs underneath the diaphragm. And then we could choose to synapse in none of those points. And we'll just end up down at the adrenal medulla, which is a gland on the kidney. And that releases adrenaline. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to be our fight or flight nervous system. Its goal is to keep us alive in danger. So it's going to do things like increase our heart rate and blood pressure, dilate our pupils. It's going to send extra blood to our skeletal muscle. And it's going to make sure we're not going to the bathroom. It's going to shunt blood away from our from our digestive organs to our organs and muscles that need it more. And so it's going to do this through a variety of receptors here. So the sympathetic receptors are going to be our alpha, beta, and then dopaminergic receptors here. So these are metabotropic receptors, which means that they use the G protein coupled receptor for cell signaling. And then our sympathetic nervous system is going to have short preganglionic fibers and then long postganglionic neurons. So it's going to be really short out to that sympathetic chain ganglia, and then we're going to have a longer nerve fiber after that sympathetic chain ganglia. And then the neurotransmitters that are secreted by the sympathetic nervous system. So our presynaptic neurons are going to secrete acetylcholine all presynaptic neurons of the autonomic nervous system are going to secrete acetylcholine. And then we're going to secrete epinephrine or norepinephrine from our postsynaptic nerves. So an example of this might be a neurotransmitter leaves the spinal cord, secretes acetylcholine onto the sympathetic chain ganglia, and then the synapse after the sympathetic chain ganglia might secrete norepinephrine onto an alpha receptor, an alpha-1 receptor. Or we might just skip the collateral ganglia and the sympathetic chain ganglia and send acetylcholine. So this is still our presynaptic neuron, right? We'll send acetylcholine onto the adrenal medulla and release acetylcholine onto a nicotinic receptor, a nicotinic 2 receptor. And then the adrenal medulla will release epinephrine or adrenaline into the bloodstream. So then for our parasympathetic nervous system, this is our rest and digest system here. So the parasympathetic system is going to be more activated when we are at rest, when we're eating, when we're not running for our lives. It's going to do things like, create tears in our eyes. It's going to lubricate our eyes, activate those lacrimal glands. It's going to contract the sphincter of our bladder, and then it's going to relax the urethral sphincter so that we use the bathroom. It's going to induce peristalsis. It's going to constrict the pupils, and it's also going to constrict the bronchioles because we don't need that much air or light when we're not running for our lives. So the parasympathetic nervous system is going to synapse onto terminal ganglia. It's going to have a very short, I wrote this down wrong, sorry. We're gonna have a very long presynaptic fiber and a very short postsynaptic fiber, because that nerve is gonna travel far away from the spinal cord, and then it's going to synapse onto a terminal ganglia that's actually pretty close to the organ that we are innervating. So that distance from the terminal ganglia to the organ that we're innervating with the parasympathetic nervous system is pretty short. For the parasympathetic nervous system, we're going to use muscarinic or nicotinic receptors. These both respond to acetylcholine, and this is known as the craniosacral division because it has its origins in the brain, the cerebrum, and the sacral part of the spinal cord. And the vagus nerve is responsible for the majority of parasympathetic innervation. So then there's the somatic nervous system. This is our sensory and skeletal muscle innervation. And we use N1 receptors in the somatic nervous system. And we're just going to use one nerve that runs from the spinal cord to these skeletal muscles. And the receptor on our skeletal muscle is going to be a nicotinic 1 receptor. So it's going to respond to acetylcholine. All right, let me make sure that I checked everything off before I move on to the next section. Okay. So moving on to cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. So our cholinergic receptors are the receptors that are going to respond to acetylcholine. And then these receptors are going to be muscarinic receptors 1 through 5 and nicotinic receptors 1 and 2. And then our adrenergic receptors are going to respond to catecholamines. And these are going to be things like dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And these consist of alpha, beta, and dopaminergic receptors. So some examples of what these would do in the body. So a good rule of thumb is that even numbered receptors are usually inhibitory and odd are going to be excitatory. So if we have beta 2 receptors on the bronchioles of our lungs, what's going to happen is that since we need our bronchioles to dilate during a fight or flight situation where the sympathetic nervous system is going to be active, remember the sympathetic nervous system is going to secrete a catecholamine, either epinephrine or norepinephrine, and this is going to bind to this beta receptor. So since we're sympathetic, we're going to be dilating our bronchioles to get more air in. And so that's an example. But so the reason that this would be inhibitory is because we're inhibiting the smooth muscle contraction of that alveoli. Another example would be the beta 1 receptors on the heart. So these are excitatory. So during a sympathetic nervous system moment of innervation, maybe we're running for our lives, and that beta 1 receptor gets stimulated, what will happen is that receptor is going to increase the force and rate of contraction in order to send blood and more oxygen and nutrients to the rest of our body so that we can function with more ability. And then our heart is also going to have receptors on it that will cause it to dilate. It will cause those coronary arteries to dilate so that the heart can get more nutrients and blood to itself as well. And so that would most likely be a beta 2 receptor. And then on our eyeballs, so the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system, they both innervate all these organs, and this is a concept that we call dual innervation. And it's basically whatever nervous system is being expressed the most in any given moment is what we're going to see manifest in our organs, right? So if we're in a more rest and digest time where we have more parasympathetic activity going on, we're going to stimulate the muscarinic receptor on the eye and cause that pupil to constrict. Or if we're running for our lives and we need more light in our eye to see more, see attackers coming, then we're going to stimulate that alpha 1 receptor that's going to dilate the eye. All right. So a good rule of thumb here, you can think A, B, C, D. And then A goes with C, or you're going to have a bad day. So alpha generally is going to constrict, and then beta is going to dilate. And there are body parts that only have sympathetic nervous system activation, such as your gland, like your sweat glands, your blood vessels, and then your erector pili muscles are only going to have innervation, sympathetic innervation. So the alpha 1 receptor is going to constrict the blood vessels on your skin. It's going to make your erector pili muscles stand on end and give you goosebumps. And then it's also going to cause some generalized sweating, right? It's going to stimulate those sweat glands. So now just let me see if I'm missing anything here. So we compared and contrasted the sympathetic division, parasympathetic division, and the somatic nervous system. We talked about their points of origin, number of neurons in the pathway, the location of the ganglia, the neurotransmitters, types of receptors, the actions. We talked about cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. We explained the different subdivisions of each type, and then I gave some mechanisms of action for each type of receptor. So what would happen when a neurotransmitter binds to the receptor? So yeah, the somatic nervous system here is going to, basically this originates from spinal nerves. The dorsal root is going to be our sensory, And then the ventral root, the anterior portion of the spinal cord, is going to be our motor units there that we'll express. All right, thanks for watching. Have a good one.